When I made this, I was taking a class in magic and ritual, the similarities and differences between the two, especially in terms of ritual.
Since I am completing a degree in psychology and I feel strongly that this topic is missing something crucial unless the science of the mind and behavior is brought into the equation, I thought I would run with a concept on that note. We discussed a lot about the what's and some about the hows of ritual, but not as much about the whys, and that's something I'm interested in the most, actually. Early on, we had a reading, chapter 4 of Jonathan Z. Smith's book about imagining religion, entitled The Bare Facts of Ritual. I found this essay to be really fascinating. It got my gears going concerning the potential origins of why we as humans perform rituals. It points out our inherent ability of pattern recognition and the tendency towards connection of disparate things and events into systems of internal sympathetic correspondence or significance between them. Examples are given how accidental or incidental occurrences, as well as more reliably consistent events, became incorporated into or entirely turned into rituals, especially when incidents occurred in places deemed important to a tribe or people. Mundane events and acts acquired holy significance or meaning because of their proximity to specific places and people, which acted as sort of like a focusing lens, increasing the importance associated with those places and people. Sometimes simply because prominent or well-known members of a people enacted something or declared it to be important, it subsequently became a process that was repeated through rituals and cultural customs. An example of this, for instance, that Smith gave was in ancient Israel. If gossip occurred within the confines of the area of the temple, it would be deemed divinely inspired and was potentially incorporated into the Torah. Ultimately, what divides the sacred and profane is arbitrary, as attentional awareness on certain events gave them supremacy over others due to situational circumstance. What separates the divine from the mundane are labels and mental maps that become codified into culture long ago. Sanctioned versus prohibited acts were not merely comprised of what a people deemed moral or not, but were instant inheritances from earlier attempts to order the world from chaos and make sense of it. Religious ritual was a sort of coping strategy, an attempt to reconcile the incongruous nature of human experience. And so, especially the more predictable events like seasonal changes in nature, notable moments during a life cycle like birth, coming of age, and death were given high religious importance and their respective corresponding rituals. The rest of Smith's essay talks about the bear hunting rituals of northern peoples, such as the early Siberian tribes, and how they lived a pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer existence, where encounters with animals were not rare events and adventures outside of urban life seen as dangerous confrontations with the other, but were more intimate and common affairs. Later cultures of farmers frame these encounters psychologically as a sort of dualistic struggle between order and chaos, good and evil, life and death. But for a Siberian hunter, it was just a fact of everyday life, absolutely necessary for subsistence. The hunt was a game with specific parts and complex rules, and the dynamic between man and animal was more respectful and equitable. It was not a duel between king and beast, but somewhat civil, at least on the part of the hunter, of course, interplay between guest and host. The meat procured was a gift of the forest. The rules for killing a bear involved not utilizing undue advantage over it or killing it when it was most vulnerable, but rather finding a sort of compromise that was deemed acceptable. And this included, in many cases, having to face it at close range, including hand-to-hand combat. After the kill, all sorts of intricate practices and taboos had to be maintained regarding dividing up its corpse. and giving the bear's soul remembrances and a sort of atonement for having killed it. The hunter was not boastful afterwards, but remorseful. I read all this and it made a ton of sense to me. I was buying into most of his arguments, but one thing that bothered me though was something that took me a minute to put my finger on. I feel like the author got so close to a crucial thesis, but I think he kind of lost the plot a bit, or at least missed a great opportunity to hone in on or realize one aspect that I would like to spend most of the remainder of this talk about. So towards the end, Smith mentions these odd songs and poems that the Yakut and other tribes sung during these bear hunts. What was so strange about them was how completely, utterly divorced from reality they were. In these songs, the hunter would hypocritically claim that they didn't mean to kill the bear, that it was an accident, it died a natural death, that it was killed in its own best interests. And then they finished with a phrase that seemed to half-assedly finally admit that, well, no, really in actuality they did kill the animal. Super weird, right? For a culture that was so obsessed with honoring the animal, why would they seemingly dishonor it with a lie, creating a blatant contradiction between word and deed? At a surface glance, this seemed really weird, and his arguments attempting to explain it fell a little short for me. He goes on to say that ritual represents a controlled environment, and that the enactment of singing these sorts of songs and performing a ritual represents like an idealized or perfect version of what should have happened, where all the variables are controlled, and instead of how things played out, and on some level, the hunter knows that he's not in control. Okay, well, I'll give you that. This sort of gets to the truth, but I don't entirely buy it. I just feel like it's missing something crucial. He's looking at this through too rational of a lens, and then it hit me. Oh my God, this is classic dissociation. This is the effect of trauma. So I don't care who you are, how brave or well-trained you are, a close encounter with a humongous wild animal violently defending itself is scary as hell. And the fear from that experience makes for a pretty poignant memory. If you escape the experience alive and triumphant, whether you got mauled or not, you're probably going to leave it with a significant amount of nervous system shock, simply from the physiological arousal response that happens during it. Let me explain. For a good while now, hunters have had the technological convenience of the ability to kill from afar, using shotguns or other missiles to fell an animal from a great distance. This allows for quite a bit of physical and emotional separation from the act of killing a dangerous animal. But if you were to hunt an enormous brown bear the way the ancients did, you're in a life or death situation, and that is an entirely different experience from a physiological perspective. I rarely meet someone who realizes what trauma actually is. People have a vague idea. They fundamentally understand it's an after effect of bad experiences, which is typically negative. But when it comes down to it, few people get how it truly works. The only reason I understand it personally at all is due to my own years of training in trauma therapy and subsequent processing of my own and others' experiences. So I'm not at all putting anyone down here for pointing out that it isn't generally well understood. There's something about trauma that's incredibly confusing and mysterious, just outside the reach of objective comprehension. Trauma is primordial. It's something that has been with us since the dawn of time, and yet we barely understand it. Recent studies have shown that it may be something that is handed down generationally through epigenetic inheritance, or experiences our ancestors underwent during their lifetime. I know people who have panic attacks who have no idea why they get them. Lots of folks have generalized diffuse anxiety too, and plenty of people go through bouts of depression as well. But only some of them are actually aware of the cause. Trauma is weird. We get that it sucks and that we can learn from our experiences, but as to how we can easily and reliably get out of a traumatized state, or in some cases how and why we got there in the first place, this largely remains a mystery to most people. This is because it is inherently a non-cognitive phenomenon and is not something that occurs within the bounds of rationality. It's in our nature to rationalize things, but to put this constraint on trauma is one of the greatest mistakes that humans have been continually making for a long time. For simplicity and time's sake, and I'm greatly oversimplifying here, your nervous system has 3 primary modes of expression. You're in a constant operating state where at least one mode is primarily the one in charge, but really each mode is functioning at all times to some extent. In the standard model, you have 2 somewhat involuntary modes that regulate your body functions automatically, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. These operate mostly outside of conscious awareness, yet are responsible for quite a bit of our conscious experience. And this pretty much goes unacknowledged. According to the more recent polyvagal theory, you actually have a 3rd mode, the social nervous system. And this is a more voluntary mode of expression that's actually most optimal for getting through a typical day and meeting life's more normal yet intellectually complex tasks that only humans engage in by utilizing our outer cortexes. But what about when you're faced with a threat? In that case, your body reverts to utilizing its older, more primitive evolutionary biology. Your parasympathetic nervous system gets to take on the duties of resting, restoring, and recharging. But when you encounter a fearful or unpredictable situation, your sympathetic nervous system takes hold, and it's the boss in charge. When you panic and your sympathetic nervous system kicks in and becomes activated or aroused, the hypopituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis in your body, sets off a hormonal cascade where you rapidly release adrenaline and cortisol in order to harness the proper resources for the threatening situation you're faced with. So your heart rate increases, body temperature goes up, pupils dilate, breathing becomes more rapid, and you get more oxygen and blood flow to your limbs so that you can respond accordingly. The sense of fear proportionate to the occasion arises, and in responding to the situation, you go into fight or flight mode, or sometimes if you don't optimally respond, you freeze. Stress and trauma are an adaptive survival response to threat, and despite seemingly otherwise, they are not nonsensical. In other words, there are situations where it's the appropriate response to flee, stay and fight, or play dead and become frozen. However, the way in which we as humans process these experiences has changed dramatically from the rest of the mammalian kingdom, barring to some degree our domesticated pets, which we have actually imprinted our nervous system onto in terms of our behaviors quite a bit. This change has tragically been to our detriment to a great extent. So when a lion chases a gazelle, and the gazelle successfully recognizes the threat in time and it runs for its life, if it survives and escapes the encounter, the first thing that gazelle does is find a safe place to hide. It stops, and it begins dramatically trembling and tremoring. It stays there and does this for as long as it needs, sometimes for quite a while. It goes into the same bodily state as when the threat occurred, and symptoms actually worsen for a bit. And yet, by letting the severity increase for a moment, this allows it to let go of all the pent-up energy and charge of what it just went through. so that it can return to normal activity without being hindered too much. Unlike most animals, which undergo this completion process to let go of the highly energized stress of the moment, we possess a highly developed prefrontal cortex, which gives us the option to actually entirely bypass the completion process our older autonomic responses would go through after a threat evasion event. Most often, instead of acknowledging the experience we just went through and going through the natural process of letting go of all that nervous system activation, we utilize this decision-making and planning center of our brains to rationalize the experience we just underwent and all the emotions and sensations related to it. It's an active, conscious suppression response. While this is certainly an evolutionary step up in complexity from how mammals typically deal with this problem, it's a system that hasn't fully evolved yet. We're sort of in the middle of that progression, and unfortunately we're paying a steep price for it in the form of pent-up stress and emotion that actually stay in our system as holding patterns and memories of less than optimal responses to situations. This isn't something woo-woo either. I'm talking about something that actually causes a relatively permanent change in physiology and brain and body chemistry. Our nervous systems seek homeostasis towards the most relaxed state or position possible, and anything outside of that is somewhat untenable, as it takes biological energy to maintain a more aroused state. Incomplete responses to threats, such as when we freeze up, keep us in a state of higher energy expenditure, even if the threat is long gone and there's no more danger. Our body still thinks there is. Instead of completing the sympathetic response to a threat to its logical conclusion, either via fight or flight, we get overwhelmed, jump the gun, and give up, going into parasympathetic response or freeze mode. The body starts to shut down. Through evolution and our tendency towards over-rationalization, we essentially lost the counterbalance to threat reaction. We misunderstood what's happening, especially since it feels worse before it gets better, and we interrupt the optimal response towards resolution, distracting ourselves out of the experience, thinking that the feeling will go away eventually, and thus we carry the result around with us. This is what trauma is. It's unresolved, stagnant stress from the inability to feel fully safe due to improper resolutions of fear-inducing situations. This is why people end up with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, what used to be known as shell shock. It's the reason for hypervigilance and the inability to relax. In the most extreme cases and instances of incredibly stressful events, an individual can become so dissociated from reality and numb as a result of interrupting the natural sequence of responses that they actually develop other multiple personalities, a condition known as DID, or dissociative identity disorder. I know someone with this condition. It's no joke. When it comes to how we deal with this, we're our own worst enemy in this regard. It was mentioned in class that the Bible is trauma literature, and I really appreciated hearing that because it really dovetails with my central argument here. I've heard an idea floated out there that ancient humans long ago experienced an ordeal that was so traumatizing that it has stayed with us for thousands of years, and that this was likely a global flood event. I respectfully disagree with this theory. I think we underwent an event far more fundamental and several degrees of magnitude more traumatizing. I preface this next part with saying that I respect all the compelling interpretations of the fall from the Garden of Eden event, and including the notion that it was the beginning of original sin, or a fall from grace or divine coexistence, some kind of metaphysical transformation from one state to another, or that it has to do with receiving certain knowledge, perhaps of an existential or even sexual nature. I'm not here to contest any of these. I do happen to prefer the idea that it points to an unprecedented existential crisis, and so I'm going to run with that here. But it doesn't make my theory better or invalidate any of those other ones. Also, I don't want to, disparage the concepts of intelligent design, Darwinism, or some kind of hybrid event. But since this talk is through the lens of psychology, and I do tend to lean towards the Darwinian explanation myself, I'm going to leave my scientist cap on for now. So there's a concept in evolutionary biology called punctuated equilibrium. And essentially, it's the notion that organisms accumulate mutations over many generations, genetic mutations, without expressing them in obvious ways, until suddenly, under a new generation, they're spontaneously expressed. This spontaneous expression has been speculated to be being tied to sudden bursts or rays of cosmic radiation. The new phenotype or trait that is expressed seemingly out of nowhere can be so drastic as to seem as if it was created, as if it created a new type of organism altogether. It's basically the idea that sometimes evolution happens in a sort of cadenced rhythm with sudden violent transients rather than as a slow linear progression. I think it's possible our primate ancestors may have experienced something like this as it pertains to brain complexity and consciousness. Perhaps the transition from animal consciousness to something more self-conscious was rapid, something occurring in one generation even. If this is so, then I would imagine this would single-handedly be the most terrifying, bewildering, and traumatizing event in our entire history. Just imagine undergoing such a transition. For that first organism or generation to experience it must have been something else. It kind of conjures up the image of the monolith in the movie 2001, where suddenly the chimpanzees go totally apeshit out of fear and confusion and start massacring each other. I may be going out on a limb here, but I do think something like this happened at some point. And I don't really buy the idea that the transition towards self-consciousness, or consciousness of the self, more accurately, was entirely incremental in an inchworm sort of manner. If it did occur, then by the time we develop language and culture, we would no doubt many generations later be attempting to come up with an interesting story to explain it. And in some respects, I think the Adam and Eve story and many other creation stories fit the bill. Perhaps this experience was mediated or catalyzed by the accidental discovery of psychedelic entheogens, as the infamous Terence McKenna stoned ape theory posits. That's the idea that at some point our primate ancestors stumbled upon hallucination-inducing substances such as mushrooms or ergot or some other alkaloid-containing plants, and it profoundly changed their thought process to the point where they were permanently altered. Such experiences can induce mental epiphanies along with weird phenomena like glossolalia and the formation of proto-language like utterances. And so I don't find it too far-fetched that that could have been a factor in all this. Just to digress for a moment, unfortunately with this project I had an immense amount of material that I realized at a certain point probably would have made this talk about 2 hours long. And it was stuff surrounding shamanic practices and initiatic secret societies and the relationship of their practices to trauma and coping with trauma. And I wish I could have included it in here so badly, but unfortunately, for time's sake, I had to eject it. So to wrap things up here, I think the first ever ancient bear hunter, or the first conscious group of hunters of any animals, probably came up with these odd, incongruous songs because they were dissociating from the experience, or they were trying to recall an ancestor's dissociation experience that they were told about. Hunting a dangerous wild animal up close can be incredibly frightening and traumatic, whatever the outcome. It's a very trying experience. And it also shouldn't go unsaid that these were magnificent, venerated creatures. I imagine the first people or person to come up with these types of songs was so shook from the experience that they had to express it in some way. And the way that they ultimately got it out of their system was pretty strange, reflecting its innate emotional disjunction. This, goes way beyond cognitive dissonance. They may have had not only a great amount of pent-up fear and anxiety from the experience, but maybe a substantial amount of remorse and sorrow for having killed the bear as well. To go from hunting by instinct to being aware that one is taking the life of a creature that may also be potentially sentient must have been quite a rough psychological transition for humanity. All these feelings would have been confusing, frustrating, and haunting, perfect fodder for a new cultural custom to honor the event. That the songs were so paradoxical, I think, speaks to the hunter's innate state of dissociation from the event itself, a sort of psychic break from reality. Humans no longer cope the way mammals do, and yet we have to cope somehow. And I think ritual was one of the first ways we figured out how to do that. That we developed intellectual complexity and compassion, and an idealized right that attempted to soften the blow of a gnarly ordeal like this makes quite a bit of sense as a response, I think. And as a species, I think we haven't hardly begun in resolving our current and past traumas, and I fear this process is overtaking us. Instead of going into and facing the experience, we're becoming more fragmented, more dissociated. The modern world and technology gives us many wonders, but leaves us feeling more isolated. We dive into endless escapism in virtual worlds while we kill the planet and poison ourselves in the process. We are still knee-deep in an existential crisis, maybe never as extreme as now. Instead of facing who and what we are, we pile it on and come up with strategies as extreme as transhumanism, where our end goal is to exit biology entirely. This feels like a grim future. At some point, I think we have to come to terms with the fact that a large part of ourselves is not rational, not consciously acting, a scared animal that backed itself into a corner of its own making. A richer understanding of the nature of trauma and the active practice of ritual can be one tool to bring us back to ourselves.